Most monitoring tools check that your API returned a 200 OK and call it done. That's not enough. An API can return a 200 with a completely broken response body, wrong data, missing fields, empty results, and a basic monitoring will tell you everything is fine while your customers hit error in production. In this video, I'll show you how to actually monitor an API in UptimeRobot with two real-world case examples you can test yourself, plus the use cases worth setting this up for. Why HTTP monitoring isn't enough. A regular HTTP monitor checks if your endpoint responds and what status code is returned. That catches the obvious failures. The API is unreachable or it's returning 500s. But it misses the ones that hurt the most. The API is technically up, returning 200, but the response is wrong. The login endpoint returns a successful response, but the token field is missing. The pricing endpoint returns a price of 0. The status field says error, but the HTTP status code is still 200 because the developer didn't wire it up correctly. API monitoring catches all of that. Instead of just checking the status code, it parses the JSON response and validates the actual content, specific fields, specific values, specific structure. If the response is malformed, you'd find out immediately. Setting up an API monitoring. From the dashboard, click Add New Monitor and pick API Monitoring. You'll see a slightly different setup screen from a regular HTTP monitor. You see Get by default, but you can switch to Post, Put, Patch, Delete, or Options, depending on which endpoint you're checking and how it's designed to be called. Let's check. Request details. This is where you configure authentication if your endpoint needs it. Basic auth, digest, or buried token for things like JWT or zero auth. You can also set the request body for post and put calls, either as form data or a JSON, and add custom headers. Let's also check assertions. This is the part that makes API monitoring more powerful than regular HTTP monitoring. An assertion is a rule that says this field in the response must equal this value. You pick a field using JSONPath syntax, pick a comparison operator like equals, contains, greater than, or is not null, and set the expected value. You can add up to 5 assertions per monitor combined with AND or logic. If the response comes back and the assertion passes, the monitor stays up. If any required assertion fails, the monitor flips to down and you get an alert. A working example you can test right now. Let me show you a real example. I'm going to monitor GitHub's public API to confirm a specific field is still where I expect it to be. I'll use a GET request to api.github.co. That's their API route. It returns a JSON object listing all of their endpoints. For the assertion, I'll set the property to current _user_URL, the comparison to equals, and the target value to api.github.com/user. That tells UptimeRobot to call the API, look at the field called current_user_URL, and check that the value is exactly what I expect. I click Create. The monitor runs, hits the GitHub API, validates the assertion, and stays up. If GitHub ever changes that field's value, my monitor flips to down, even though the API itself is still returning a 200 OK. This is the simplest possible example, but it demonstrates the core idea. I'm not just checking that GitHub's API works, I'm checking that it works the way my code expects. A more advanced example, checking a specific field in a list. For something that looks more like a real production monitoring, here's a second example using JSONPlaceholder, a free public API that's the canonical demo endpoint developers use for testing. I'll do a GET request to JSONPlaceholder.typicode.com/users, which returns a list of user objects. Each one has fields like name, email, address, and company. The kind of structured user data you'd actually monitor in a real application. For the assertions, I'll target a specific field and a specific item in the list. Let's say the first position .name, which means the name field on the first user in the response array. I'll set it equal to Lynn Graham because that's what the API returns first. I'll create the monitor, UptimeRobot fires the request, parses the response, validates the first user's name matches, and stays up. If the API ever changes its response or if the field structure drifts, my assertion catches it immediately. In a real monitoring setup, you'd usually write something more flexible, for example, checking that the fields exist at all with is not null rather than matching one specific value. But this example shows exactly how an assertion catches a mismatch the moment it happens. UptimeRobot also supports post, put, patch, delete, and options request with the same assertion pattern. Same JSONPath, same operators, just a different HTTP method. The API is worth setting this up for. API monitoring's real values show up when you start applying it to specific use cases. A few worth knowing about: payment APIs, Stripe, PayPal, your billing provider. The bar isn't just is Stripe up, is my checkout flow call to Stripe returning a valid charge token with the right amount. Authentication and SSO providers. Auth0, Okta, your identity layer. If your login flow depends on a specific token shape or field in the author response, an API monitoring catches it the moment the provider changes their API, which they do more often than you'd hope. Third-party data APIs. Weather services, geolocation, content APIs, e-commerce inventory feeds, anywhere your app depends on a third party returning data in a specific shape. And your own public APIs. If your customers depend on your API, you should know the exact moment it stops returning what you promised them before they file a support ticket about it. That's API monitoring in UptimeRobot, same setup speed as a regular monitor, but with the assertion layer that validates what comes back. If you want to try it, the link is in the description box. This particular feature at UptimeRobot is not free, but it's available on all the paid plans. Thanks for watching and happy monitoring!